Welcome to everyone to the final round of the United States University Debating Championships. I'm not going to say much. Hobart and William Smith is very proud to host this important tournament. We look forward to many more tournaments in the future, and I hope that our guests this weekend have had a wonderful time and will come back to future tournaments that we host. And I am here to introduce the debaters in today's event. On the opening government team, these two gentlemen from Yale. On the opening opposition, we have a pair of debaters from Stanford University. On the closing government, we have two debaters from Princeton. And on closing opposition, two debaters from Chicago. They are here to debate without any further delay on the topic. This House would eliminate peer review. Am I getting that exactly right? This House abolish. Excuse me. This House would abolish peer review. Thank you very much. Good luck to all the debaters. I look forward to an excellent debate.
On opening government, we think it is deeply regrettable that there is tons of fantastic research that will never see the light of day simply because a reviewer had a bad day or did not believe that that research met the extraordinarily high bar for their super prestigious journal. What happens currently in the status quo? Journals that operate in particular fields appoint reviewers who are often the highest prestige researchers who represent advances in those fields, and then when a researcher wants to submit a paper, they send it to the paper. That paper gives that research to a couple of reviewers, gives them a couple of months to spend it, and then they either say this paper is good, it should be submitted to the journal, you should revise and resubmit, or they reject the journal altogether. What would we rather have on our side of the house? A couple of things to say here. Number one, we think that governments, universities, and think tanks, individuals or organizations who are otherwise funding things like journals in the status quo, should use that money to go to other funds and bodies that essentially have the responsibility to collect and display papers. That might be organizations like conferences, events, boards, and we think it can even be done by journals that exist in the status quo. We think that instead of having a journal that only admits like 10 or 15 articles, we think that they should produce a centralized posting forum where every single piece of research that is submitted is posted up for discussion. And recognize that we want this paper to be associated and be right next to a board that allows that discussion to be displayed and provide an impartial view of that discussion. That can be done through a couple of things. For example, highlighting papers that are complementing the paper, that are criticizing a certain element of the paper, that are extraordinarily anti the paper. But it's important that this is done for like an impartial method, which I think we can be out on our side of the house. What are the financial incentives? One, we think you get paid if one, your paper becomes, every time your paper gets cited by, for example, another paper. Two, you produce a refutation paper that refutes another piece of research that is submitted to this discussion journal, and that gets cited. Three, you submit a paper that replicates the results of that paper, and that paper gets cited. Fourth, that you generally contribute to the public discussion, whether it's posting on the comment board or providing a general comment, a first thought about these kinds of things. And we think the financial incentives, particularly here, can be skewed and bent towards, I guess, the things that you want to foster. For example, if you want to foster new research, weighting it more heavily, the ability to get a citation for a new paper as opposed to, for example, a replication paper, much less for just simply contributing to the public discussion. But all of those things have financial incentives behind them. We think in the status quo, journals are terrible at determining which kinds of papers should be accepted. First of all, the thing that I just want to emphasize is that the rejection process is extraordinarily unaccountable. You cannot ask somebody why it's the case that they rejected a paper. Often they might provide a reason, but it could be a very, very brief reason. It is also not that they want something that they're like super accountable to justify. That is to say, it doesn't necessarily look terrible for them if they just say, we didn't like this paper, or give a particular reason for it. And even if they do provide a reason, it is extraordinarily hard to determine if that reason is actually the genuine reason that they rejected your paper or not. The counterfactual, obviously, is that people can post things that are negative about a paper, but they have to back it up with reasoning. They cannot be the sole arbiter of whether or not that paper gets accepted, because they are not determining whether that paper is accepted, only providing an opinion about it that contributes to the public discussion. we think that reviewers are likely to reject a couple of sorts of papers on our side of the house. Number one, we think that there's extraordinarily academic self-defense bias. That is to say, you are likely to reject the sorts of papers that criticize your research in a couple of ways. Number one, obviously papers that directly refute what the results of your paper make you look bad, so you don't want to bring that into the public domain, because it might be the case that that makes your research unaccountable. But number two, we think this is far more general. That is to say, if there are scholars that are presenting new paradigms on way to do research, new methodological systems, or criticisms of previous methodological systems that you relied on, then you're likely to reject those things as well, because they make your research look less high quality, or they even might be afraid that that's going to put you out of a job, because now there are new China scholars who are suggesting a new paradigm, while the majority of your body of work has been relied on a previous one. Number two, we think the majority of reviewers are extraordinarily risk-averse. That is to say, they're more likely to reject papers than to accept papers just prima facie, because one, if that paper turns out to be incorrect, which is like hard to determine, but it's very hard to determine this over like the course of an 8th or 9th month period, you might not be totally sure that you caught everything that was wrong about the paper. There might have been a small flaw in the data that you were unable to identify, but someone might find it in 3 or 4 years. And that makes you look like a terrible reviewer, because then you believe that, this kind of person let this research through. Why did they do that? The thing that I want to emphasize is that these individuals are particularly likely to be averse against the downside because they are reviewers. That is to say, they already have an established economic career, where a career in whatever field that they're operating in. They already have enough prestige to be selected for to be a reviewer for a particular journal. It looks horrible to them if they were the arbiter of allowing a terrible piece of research to come through, which is hard for them to determine in that 8th or 9th month period. Number three, we think that generally speaking, these reviewers are extraordinarily protective of the prestige of the journal, because their resume says that they're a reviewer for this journal, so they want to make sure that only the best research comes in, and they want to make sure that only the research that they believe is good comes in. We think that that has a couple of problems. Number one, I just think it means that a lot of research that is not 100% good, but is at the 90 or 80% level, is likely to be rejected. You say we only want the very, very best research for this journal. There's 90% good research is maybe still worthy of discussion, but it doesn't want to be in our journal, so we're just going to kick it out. Two, I just think it means you inflame more biases. When you see somebody that is that operates in a different field that is separate from you, or maybe if you have an implicit bias against a particular minority in their scholarship, or just like a particular institution, then you're likely to emphasize those things. What are the impacts to rejection? And the thing that I want to be clear is that this argumentation stands irregardless of whether or not we prove that the rejection happens well or poorly. But for that, I'll take closing.
So in the status quo, there's a handful of journals in the Master of Journalists that are considered reliable because of peer review, and there are a litany of whack job predatory journals that publish unreliable information. How do you differentiate between those two in your world?
Sure. On our side of the house, number one, we said we wouldn't have these predatory journals. We have centralized bodies that post on particular forums. But I think our accountability mechanism for our research is that we produce these sorts of public forums in which that research actually gets analyzed. That is to say, we actually solve the problem on your side of the house. Because you do have predatory journals in which people believe, oh, this was in this journal, so it must be good. But on our side of the house, instead you can look up that research and see what public forum it's been posted in and see the discussion about that journal. If it's truly a fake article, then the majority of people would, because they want to protect just like their field altogether, would go and say, yeah, this is a fake journal, or this is a fake piece of research, or this is a fake article. I think this is the problem that is much worse on your side of the house. Impacts to rejection. Number one, it slows the pace of innovation. And that's just because you reject a lot of good research that is innovative, but I think it means that people default to particular types of research that are easier to get accepted. And that means research that is more marginal or existing research, or research that is extraordinarily replicative of existing models, which is why there's a replication in crisis in fields like economics. Two, this heightens the risk of doing research. Doing research takes an extraordinarily long time. Writing a paper takes 3 or 5 years. The problem is, if you could go at the end and that paper gets totally rejected, then you have literally no payoff for that time that you spent doing your research. On our side of the house, at least, even if it's not the most popular piece of research on the journal, it still gets cites, it still looks extraordinary, and you're still able to point to it and say, I published this paper in this journal. But three, I just think it's important that these people get remunerated for their time in some way. If it gets rejected, there's no way for them to reap the benefit. On our side of the house, at least they spur discussion, and at least they spur citations. For that reason, I'm very proud of ourselves.
Thank the Prime Minister and call on the Leader of Opposition.
Panel, I think that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claims in the past, such as the COVID vaccine works, such as tapered scoring in BP does more good than harm, to be established as common fact. In a world where the media and people have limited bandwidth to pass this information from themselves, with limited expertise to decide whether or not the statistical methods used were true or false. As any CS student can tell you, the work of people blog posts on archive or whatever are not reliable sources of information, and it's actually very difficult even for a CS student to pass through these to decide which are good and which are false. What is our stance? Firstly, we support peer review. Secondly, academic journals will require editors and external reviewers, often experts in their field, to approve articles when they are published. These experts will be drawn from a diverse range of schools of thought within that discipline, as well as a diverse range of backgrounds. We can mandate this, but also many journals already do this as an existing matter of public relations, as well as appeasing the community. Third, we're happy for people to continue to use things like online mediums and blog posts to disseminate ideas, but the stamp of approval of peer review is important in allowing the public to decide what is important and what can be trusted and what cannot. Two arguments. Firstly, we reduce the influence of academics in society, and that's bad. Secondly, that we make academia worse with impacts for the broader community. But before that, some miscellaneous refutation. They say the bar to publishing is incredibly high. This is a good thing, guys. Journals often require diverse panels. There is an asymmetry because we require extraordinary claims to have extraordinary evidence, and everyone on this diverse panel has to agree. There is no favoring of particular schools of thought. We need common consensus. Moreover, they never engage with the comparative, which is that random people, including those who are opposed to this research, can speak up against it on their side. We think that the harm of, for example, criticizing an article that refutes your earlier work is worse on their side. Why is this the case? Firstly, because online you can be anonymous. Secondly, because online, the person publishing the article, putting the article online, is often not anonymous. So there's an asymmetry there, and you can discriminate based on whether or not you don't like them as a person, for example, when you criticize them. Finally, we think that editors of large journals have skin in the game. That is to say that if you consistently reject articles that refute your school of thought, you will be criticized and probably removed as an editor by other people in the discipline. Whereas in online, where you review a much larger range of articles, there is no such accountability mechanism. Finally, let's just point out that it's unlikely an editor will be tasked to review work that directly refutes something you published in the past. That's just not how these journals work. I think this is an incredibly odd characterization. Then they said people will miss errors, and this is bad. This sort of contradicts their earlier claim that these people will be too careful. We can also issue corrections and retractions if people point it out in the future. If future research cites this work and there is a mistake, often journals retract these articles. Nothing wrong with that. Finally, they say this slows the pace of innovation. Firstly, I'll point out that in many fields, it is good that we are careful and that innovation proceeds incrementally and slowly rather than in leaps and bounds. Why is this the case? Because, I don't know, maybe you're building a rocket or something and people might die, but also when we're making extraordinary claims about human history, for example, we want to err on the side of caution. If an idea has a very large commercial application, you are free to start a company. That I don't see why that slows down innovation, so to speak. And finally, people don't burn the papers after they are not accepted for publication. Often in fields like economics, there's an iterative process where if it gets rejected, you will review it and add additional data and so on. So I don't see why the harms are really that severe in the way they characterize. First argument, that this reduces the influence of academics in society. Structurally, we think that academic checks and balances are important to allow the media and society to separate truth and fiction. They sort of asserted that academics are sort of a self-reinforcing insular community, but I don't really agree with this, and they never really justified it. We actually think the reverse. We think that academic institutions are some of the most open and accountable institutions in the world, and that academics are structurally fair, or at least the way journals are set up are fair. Firstly, because academic institutions on average tend to be more objective and progressive. Many social movements were spearheaded by academics and their students in large universities. Secondly, as I mentioned, many journals rely on a consensus system. So in a discipline like economics, where there are multiple, often politically charged viewpoints, the Chicago School versus the economic liberals, for example, they will include representatives from both on these panels of these large journals. Thirdly, just a large amount of knowledge is required to interpret the outcomes of studies, knowledge and familiarity with data. This is something that can't be understated. So we need to make sure that, essentially this is correct, and we need people with some experience in the field, which, might be slightly prejudiced, but nevertheless still hard objective expertise to review this stuff. Critically, peer review is asymmetric because, as I said, you need all editors from different school of thoughts to approve an article. So the bar of publishing is extremely high and asymmetric. The burden of proof is high, and therefore we think this is important because for the media and for broader society, peer review becomes a strong signal of believability.
Saying claims like COVID lockdowns cause more harm than good require extraordinary evidence. On the comparative, media outlets will default to reporting on blog posts and random articles published in these conference proceedings, based on which one generates more clicks. What their funders want. There is no longer an incentive to say, for example, at the end, peer-reviewed studies suggest X or Y. This is worse because many of these cater to our base desires and engage in pseudo-intellectualism. Articles that are pseudo-intellectual often appeal to nativist emotions, and it is important that the marker of peer review exists to separate what requires objectivity from the arguments of demagogues. Like Ben Shapiro's claim that Western civilization and Christianity is the primary driving force for the development of human rights. It's regarded as reductive by most historians, but these claims will have equal weight, and in fact they might appear stronger because of the pseudo-intellectualism implicit in them. Secondly, that this makes academia worse. So we think that promotion in academia will now rely on far more arbitrary criteria, things like social influence, the number of friends you make, rather than tenure decisions which are based on the number of peer-reviewed articles. Things like the blog post on your public profile, for example. Why is this bad? Firstly, it attracts more people to academia from industry, since tenure promotion is more random. These people whose comparative advantage is not perhaps in academia, but in industry. Worse, the university's funding model, in a moment, becomes far worse. Because universities, as they mentioned, and the academics, are paid based on the number of citations they have by random people. So they cater to popular research rather than important research, like pure mathematics, like philosophy. We attract professors who are rock stars without actual merit. Closing.
Shamefully, when I go on Twitter, I'm more likely to follow people who have a post at a prestigious university. That will still happen on our side, so these signals will still allow people to distinguish, but if people might like Ben Shapiro, that's also a problem with your side.
No, but we think that the additional barrier of peer review signals the believability of the specific research the person publishes, not just based on their public profile. So we think that people who are like good academics can publish bad research that fails peer review. There is still an accountability mechanism. So we think that bad quality research becomes promoted because bullshit research always has more support and funding because of the political motivations behind this. And we think that things like spoofing online reviews are also possible. This makes research worse. Also, this worsens industry research, which is important in very sensitive areas like engineering, because industry research relies on high quality standards from academic papers as a benchmark of quality. Finally, we think that this makes research from developing countries systematically ignored because academics have limited bandwidth to pass research in the media and pass the many articles that they read. Schools like Beta or NUS, for example, only became respected internationally because of the success of the academics publishing in peer-reviewed international journals. Systematic bias in academia will mean that academics from top universities won't read any of the articles published by so-called second-tier universities in developing countries because basically they have limited bandwidth. They can't read like 10,000 articles all published in the discipline, and they will default to other markers like Institute Journal of the World who published it.
Hear, hear. Thank the Leader of Opposition and call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
You good?
Let's talk about the nature of public discourse. It's visible under our side of the house, and that is crucial because it's visible discourse between academics that does not happen in the halls of universities or within closed doors of journalists or the small notes you write on the margins of a particular paper that only 3 people will ever see. That is incredibly important. When we say others dunk on it to get money, they dunk on it because they're members of the political association. They attach their name to it so that they can get the money. They're not anonymous people on the internet. Moreover, academics and conferences coalesce on good work. If you publish something that's obviously bad work, other people will dunk on it so that they can get that money. And others will recognize that there's this clearly bad work. That within 2 days, someone will have pointed out the methodological flaw in your work. And therefore, other academics won't trust it, other people won't cite it, and other conferences will be talking about other types of stuff. You can publish types of work, either in the form of comments or in terms of papers to refute other papers, and that's a direct profit incentive under our side of the house. What happens under their side is that maybe this paper doesn't come out, maybe you get this critique silently, but guess what? They go to a blog post, they go to a different journal that is willing to accept it, and guess what? The conspiratorial people in the real world believe that the COVID vaccine did not work, believe things like vaccines cause autism, because guess what? That gets circulated around in the ways that are beneficial to them. People are willing to take on this news, because guess what? They believe in being intellectual, as long as there is no clear evidence against them. When they can say that a particular scientist supports this view and it has been published in a journal, they can say, well, vaccines do cause autism. This doctor said it. No one's openly refuting them. You know why? Because right now there's no profit incentive to refuting them. Because no academics can spare the time to publish a paper saying that every single wrong paper that comes out is bad. I think that this happens not just with things that would get published in journals under their side of the house, but every single crack job view that would come out and bad economic view that would come out under their side of the house. What does that ultimately mean? I think that you're much more likely under our side of the house to get those reputations and get them publicly. Because when you post something like vaccines cause autism, instantly people have a profit incentive to say, no, that is wrong for these reasons, your methodology is incorrect. Moreover, reporters, when they report on this and share this information with the public, are expected due to journalistic standards to share both sides of the narrative because it's openly accessible to them because you have the paper and right under it you have all the comments from other political science majors that are like upvoting or downvoting on particular comments. Okay, two things to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the quality of research. Next, I'm going to talk about costs before that closing.
So the paper you're referencing, the Andrew Wakefield vaccines called autism paper, has been refuted 1,000 times because it looks really good to protect your field, to say it is valuable, and you get lots of attention as an academic disproving this.
Perfect example for our side because guess how long it took to get it recalled? It took too long to get it recalled. We could not have instant refutation of it. And yes, the paper has been taken by the journal. Yes, the journal said it was wrong. Yes, people have published papers to refute it. But that was the most prominent example, and even then, we could not get it recalled quickly enough to prevent the public from thinking that vaccines cause autism. So I think that under our side of the house, we get the rapid fire refutation that we absolutely need. Let's talk about the quality of research. It is empirically true that high-level, old tenured professors tend to be systematically dominant within these bodies. Why? One, because they have seniority and prestige, which is built up over time, because you trust the people who are like experts within their fields, but they only did that because they were able to publish papers, which as we noted is very difficult under their side. Secondly though, because becoming a junior referee is very risky, it is a time-consuming process that yes, does pay out, but young academics may not have that time between teaching classes and trying to publish their own research, because guess what? They don't have tenure, so they need to do something within 2 years. Being a referee is simply not enough. You need to be able to publish papers, so they don't take on that risk in many cases. What does this ultimately mean? I think that this means that they produce worse research that is likely to be systematically biased and cause all the harms that they talk about under their side of the house. What does this look like? First, self-defense. And note that there's no people critiquing these reviews, that they protect themselves. That these, when they talk about established views, like, oh yeah, there's the Chicago school and there's the other school, those are two already established views. We are talking about new views coming up that critique the old schools, that say that they're systematically wrong, that the paradigm of development economics, for instance, is incorrect. What do people do? Number one, they defend their own work. Number two, they defend work that they published in their journal already. What does this look like? This looks like saying, oh, well, the methodology is flawed in this way. I want you to go back and review this, because guess what? I know that you don't have the time. Or if you do have the time, I'm going to reject it another time. Secondly, though, just saying that this replication isn't novel. It isn't interesting enough. Because peer review isn't just about whether this is methodologically correct. It's also it's about whether it should be published within the journal. And being a gatekeeper there means that you can say, someone replicated work that was in the journal already, and they said that it was wrong. Someone replicated my work and said that it was wrong. I'm just not going to publish this because I'm going to say it's not that interesting, something like that. That self-defense means that you get bias in the paper. Second thing though is that you just miss mistakes sometimes, even if it's not that open bias. So the vaccines cause autism thing. Number one, I think the retractions don't happen. For all the incentives that Michael gave you, the journalists and people attached to the journal, as they concede, have their own horse in the game. But number two, these retractions don't work because often they happen too late. Because journals know that they happen too late, and people have already moved on. The media cycle has been moved on. It has been published. So even to the extent that it's retracted, people already believe it. They'll just say something like, oh, this person's being censored. The woke media came after them. And I don't think that the retractions work. What do they say on their side of the house? They say that they just go to journalists with lower standards. Moreover, they go to funded think tanks and hack jobs, as I talked about on their side of the house. The conspiratorial people, again, don't believe you unless the reasons why they're wrong are transparent and right under the academic work. They say you just need to make friends. Number one, it's not random people that are your friends. It's not literally people on the internet. It's obviously people who are members of the association or members of the journal. Number two, though, friends at a lower level is good because, again, it is a prestige game either way in terms of like getting people to like your work. The question is whether it is only tenured professors who are really old and anonymous who like your work, or whether it is people openly talking about why your work is good or bad. Number three, I think that if you're wrong under your side of the house, even your friends won't back you because they want to advance their own careers and they want to get money, so they will say that you're wrong. Let's talk finally about cost. Look, we say that you should just compensate people for their work. How does the economics work? There are a massive amount of inflows that they didn't refute. There are submission costs, there are members of the public, there are grants, etc. We, number one, pay people for their work. Maybe this is less money to reviewers, yes. But guess who is getting review money right now? The tenured old people, not the young people who need to make their careers in academia. Number two, so we get money to people who review and publish, but also we get money to the people who publish themselves and do replication. Number two, though, we decrease barriers to submission. That is to say, you do not have to have like an absolutely foolproof idea and the ability to extend the project out for 5 years in order to publish a paper. You can say, I can get this done in 1 or 2 years. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but there's much lower cost there. Number three, academics ain't sent on wild goose chases. That is, older academics, just send them taking longer time. Even if they have good intentions, it just takes so much longer. You can make a small correction in methodology without having to redo the entire paper. Impacts, number one, fewer academics, more bias. That is to say that people cannot make their careers under their side of the house because they're getting paid starvation wages by universities and they don't make money from their own work. Number two, higher costs to educational institutions, which means it's more expensive to attend university. Number three, less research, which is bad, notably, because guess what? When we have good research, we have new ideas. When we have bad research, we can refute it. Under our side of the house, we correct that bad research as well. Final thing that I want to talk about is speed, because we get research that is out faster. When we have the COVID vaccine out, we can publish that it distributes in this way very quickly. We can say how COVID works, we can say how the vaccine works. We don't need the absolute certainty. All these reasons, very proud of those.
Here. Thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
How are we all doing? Here's the underlying problem with OG. The number of papers that are cited, that are viewed, that get funding, and that are covered by the media remain the same on both sides. Because audiences have limited willingness or ability to process academic research or have it communicated to them. Given this, on our side of the house, we filter the research that is covered through peer review processes. What is the filter that exists on their side of the house? They argue that the filter should be an open discussion, never telling you who has power in this open discussion, what this open discussion results in, or why this open discussion is likely to be credible. The first observation I want to make about this open discussion is that academics don't have incentives to critique research the way that Matt claims they do. His main argument for why there's an incentive is because you get paid for publishing a paper. I'm sorry, you get paid a lot less for publishing a paper on their side of the house. And this engages with their claim that peer reviewers take funding. Yeah, sure, you have to pay 10 peer reviewers. But their side of the house guts academic funding in 3 crucial ways. Number one, the funding is spread too thin. The system, their centralized network, is overwhelmed by papers. Anyone with or without a PhD can post a paper on there. There are thousands of criticisms, often funded by random media establishments, sometimes not funded as well. And every one of them gets paid. Academic funding by default is limited. The number of donors who want to invest money in risky academia when they have very little ability to get anything out of it, when it's not funding a university, but funding apparently a centralized platform, so you don't even have the university alumni donors wanting to fund things like institutional academic research. The funding is spread across hundreds, thousands, millions of academics, and therefore you never get enough funding. Second, they actively deter funders. No thank you. A large amount of funding comes from billionaires and billionaires who went through elite university processes and trust the academic system because those are the networks that they have. When you shut peer review and take it out of the equation, what incentive do they have to throw money into research that they don't view as credible anymore, even if it enters the open discussion? That means funding is stripped from this research and you pay academics very, very less. Third, because Matt concedes that there is less high-scale, large, long-lasting research that funders believe will require or absorb a large number of funding. Because academics are content to just stop with a 2-year research project, not take any research project further, publish one paper and leave the field entirely. No thank you. An investor in that academic has no guarantee they will continue, that this research will yield results because an n=1 paper is never enough to achieve the truth, and therefore they will pull back funding. All of this together means academics will be paid trivial amounts to post their research on this large platform. Furthermore, How will media organizations distinguish between criticisms? Sure, journalists have integrity, but they don't have academic knowledge. They don't have academic credentials, and they will view every criticism paper as plausibly incredible because it was posted on a random public forum. What proxies will they use? And this is where they don't engage with authors' arguments. If they believe that peer review panels are really underrepresented, think about what media institutions will do in the absence of a peer review panel. Number one, they will look for researchers who already have no funding. In a world of very disparate funding, who will fund academic research? Overwhelmingly, it's people who, rather than funding research to discover the truth, given that people are not going to engage in the types of large-scale projects to do that, will fund research that confirms their pre-existing intuitions. This is corporations that try to fund, for example, pro-sugar research in order to market themselves as saying sugar is less healthy. There's very limited scope to criticize this research because any academic who wants to criticize it has less money than the sugar corporation throwing money at an academic, no thank you, who is publishing good research. Second of all, academic reputation. And this is where their arguments about elitism get flipped. Because if your last name in India comes from an upper caste, or if you are a recognized academic in a developing country, it is far more likely that any media organization covers your research because it's you. You won a Nobel Prize. Who cares about whether the quality of your research is actually credible? Whereas we, both through our model and through the incentives we outlined, remember this is a this house good motion, are able to ensure that peer review processes are anonymized and therefore substantially better. Finally, even if reviews happen, on their side, on our side of the house, we still have the ability to challenge institutions. We still have things like working papers being published. If there's a paradigm shift, there's competition between journals to be the journal that publishes the paradigm shift and gets the paradigm shift covered. That competition goes away on their side of the house when you have a singular centralized platform, everyone's putting their research on it, and academics pick and choose which research they even bother, no thank you, to debate. Let's talk further about their arguments on the quality of research. Number one, they mention accountability. They say, you don't know who the peer reviewers are, therefore there's very limited accountability. Arthur gives you a range of mechanisms for accountability. This includes, for example, number one, journals disclosing their peer review panels. Number two, many professions having norms of doing things like publishing working papers so the general audience knows what research is out there as to academic audiences. Three, things like conferences continue to exist on our side. Four, there's competition between journals providing accountability. On their side, there's much less accountability because people with vested political interests publish research. Their response, well, you will go on blogs instead, and aren't blogs simply much worse? Number one, criticism of blogs happens anyway. You have financial incentives because journalists will platform an academic who criticizes a really bad blog post. COVID conspiracy theories constantly have CNN doing things like interviewing journalists and ensuring they have their opinion on board, often paying them large amounts of money. Plus, they want to protect the reputation of their own profession and therefore engage in this kind of criticism, which they can't do with the Rebellion papers. Closing, do you have a POI? Okay, yeah, opening.
Under your side, you want to critique a paper, you have to write a paper, go through the process, and pay hundreds of dollars for the chance to be published. Under our side, you take 30 minutes to write a few pages, put it on the website, get a lot of upvotes, and maybe you get paid $10.
But your criticism is more likely to be awful. Journalistic organizations are less likely to trust your criticism. You're less likely to get upvotes or attention for your criticism, so your critique is a lot less effective in the first place. Going through the rigorous process ensures the criticism is meaningfully effective. Their mechanism of criticism provides one, no incentive to criticize, two, no mechanism of scaling this criticism up, three, no reason why journalistic organizations will platform this criticism, and four, don't challenge the asymmetry that comes with research publication. But if you buy none of these arguments whatsoever, here's what you are going to buy. Academic institutions become substantially weaker. This is because academia loses trust. Large numbers of people leave academia, funding goes away, and importantly, things like political institutions rely on academics less. Arthur gave you a range of mechanisms for why this is awful. None of their arguments about the academy matter if academia has zero relevance to the real world. Academia having relevance to the real world is crucial because the alternative to academia is not credibility. It is looking to credibility through things like populism and straying away from the truth. We want these institutions to retain their strength. Oppose.
Hear, hear. Thank you to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. We call on the Member of Government to open the back half of this debate.
My Lord, Tom Parker. And the thing they get wrong is, The average person is not reading peer-reviewed journals and then being like, this one said peer-reviewed, now I will believe the COVID vaccine works. People genuinely do not form their views by the court of public opinion, having debates between different academics, or by checking whether or not something is peer-reviewed. In fact, most people don't care at all. What science matters is like 1% of all the articles that are ever published. Because what I did for my thesis, and even what my thesis advisor did for his thesis, has changed no one's mind ever. The question is, for like 1 or 2 papers that could genuinely change the world, how do we make sure they get seen as soon as possible? We achieve that under our side of the house. How is it that we think that you get research which genuinely changes the world? Firstly, often you can just point out that certain policies are literally flawed. So politicians often have pretty strong incentives to have correct policy, because if many people are like homeless, or if you waste a bunch of money, they look really bad. So literally knowing whether or not what they're doing works is a thing they care about. So papers which say, this thing you passed 6 months ago, we've got this weird data set that the state doesn't have, we think it tells you this policy doesn't work, is a thing that would genuinely change policy that's really useful and happens sometimes in academia. Secondly, there are genuinely a couple of papers that publish new methods that really change the world. When I worked in a cancer lab, we referred to this one paper that invented the fitness landscape and allowed you to argue about how cancer cells will respond to radiation and evolve. That literally made a field in genomics that means that we are able to treat cancer substantially better. 80% of the work down the line did nothing. People just keep reusing those same methods. These are the things that we want to be in the public domain. We think that on both sides they are likely to be there, but we're going to explain why they come out under our side, and secondly, why they come out years earlier, because peer review, though maybe accurate, is a massive waste of everyone's time. So, what is it the case? Mostly this research is going to be public for a few reasons. Sometimes it is privately funded, in which case they just like come up with a patent, they make money under both sides, but mostly it's performed by non-profits who are forced to make this public. 1, because they're genuinely good people and chose to work in non-profits. 2, because that is often the premise of government funding they receive, like you have to share this research. And thirdly, because that allows you to show off to like the wealthy donors who fund non-profit hospitals, or to the NIH when you're doing this in the future. How is it the case, which I don't think OG proves, is this good research able to make it to the top? Because OG is correct, the probability it gets published is higher, but when there are 1 billion articles in the world, feasibly no one ever reads it. Firstly, sadly a lot of this is done by already established names, by people who already have a lot of funding, because the presence of funding is a thing that enables you to have bigger teams, smarter people working for you, and people have a track record of actually working. So sadly, our POI is correct. If there is no like sexy journal that will tell you who you should listen to, then you just go with the person that got tenure at an elite university and already has 3 papers which have influenced its stuff in the past. So we think this stuff is likely to be reached anyway. But secondly, word of mouth genuinely works, because I think the main mechanism of transmission for people within the field that we really need to access this is just, I'll say, oh, I read this really cool paper in my field, it makes sense to me, and you forward it on. That process is relatively quick, right? Like, as soon as this is published, once one person gets it sent to them by a grad student, they're then able to share it with a network of all of the relevant people in the field who care to a substantial extent. So to be clear, none of this is comparative, but we think there are substantial problems with peer review that make this process inordinately slow. Firstly, people don't publish in some instances because they're afraid that their peer reviewers will steal it, although this is sometimes minor. But secondly, until you get peer review, people are then incredibly afraid of ever trusting this research. Because if you then, like in a world where the expectations of things that are peer reviewed operate on the basis of a non-peer reviewed paper, and the small chance it turns out to be wrong, you look like a complete idiot. You didn't roll out the vaccine because you this thing wasn't peer reviewed. So the process by which people believe these papers that would otherwise be deemed to be credible is much, much slower under their side of the house. But thirdly, and kind of a trivial point, peer reviewed papers have a format they'd like you to comply to. And that means that you've got a theory section, a review of past work section, a new method section, and then an experimental section, which means that instead of one person coming up with a really smart idea and just putting it on a blog or putting it on archive, because they know that they have to upload it, what they do is they hire a grad student to find some arbitrary data set that allows them to test their technique and then make a paper 8 times the size. So a process that should take a couple of weeks, we've got this idea that could change the world, now takes 1.5 years. So the implication is very sensible here, right? It just takes longer for the stuff that would genuinely make people's lives better to be implemented, would genuinely make people's lives non-trivially worse for a short period of time until the stuff gets implemented. That, I think, is more feasible than the top half claims. Yes?
Maybe 1 in 500 of a top academic's work will change the world, but they are still publishing all 500 now on a massive forum, and they have moral hazard, i.e. they already have tenure, so they have no idea which one is the most influential. Very few of them are the most influential. How in the world are you going to find out which papers are the most influential?
Like, I think both the mechanisms I've described work reasonably well, but if these people always get their papers approved by peer review, this seems inordinarily symmetric, right? Like if Stephen Strogatz publishes a kind of medium paper, he's still Stephen Strogatz, it's still probably fine. It gets peer reviewed anyway and it gets approved, so I don't think you get any difference. But these people don't churn up hundreds of papers because they don't need to because they already have tenure, so their incentive is to wait until they publish some really cool stuff because they're able to spend large amounts of time working on it. The other thing that I think is reasonable is that you could change the world by having really bad articles. I just don't think this makes sense, right? Because the incentive for conspiracy theories exists anyway, and these people obviously are making a really stupid decision that is not the scientific consensus. And I think it is mostly a media engine that happens and works anyway. For instance, under both sides, Ben Shapiro would exist, and despite the fact he has literally no qualifications, or like Jordan Peterson has one very niche qualification in psychology, people believe him, suggests that people are not really looking at the peer review mechanism when it comes to the court of public opinion. I don't think this matters. And secondly, peer review just doesn't solve for these problems. Because if I have like 10 feasible techniques and 20 feasible data sets, I have 200 different models I pick. So I pick the one that's statistically significant, and if I p-hacking, I'm able to publish. That happens both ways, because the reviewer is just like, it is a technique that prima facie makes sense. It is a data set. That's fine. And unless they literally check all 200 and then rerun all the same analysis you do, they never find it. So the extent for you to come up, like, catch this dubious stuff is very, very minor under their side of the house. But finally, responding to OO's claims on like funding and diversity. Journals are for-profit. They do not pay people, even the people that publish. And the reason why is that your career gets made as soon as you publish in Nature. So you will pay Nature like $10,000 to get your name published. So the fact that people are expected to pay to have their article hosted is an additional barrier that makes it harder for underrepresented people to make it in this field. But secondly, I think it is just probably good for the sake of like, so that this means that the funding thing and the diversity thing doesn't stand. But I just think like, good academics have the incentive to try and find cool research and repost it, if only because that makes their Substack a bit more important and relevant down the line, and they can charge people money for it. But they do have incentives not to repost complete nonsense, but for those reasons, I think we get access to a good amount of diversity.
Here. Thank the member of government, call on the member of opposition.
Everyone good? Peer review is one of those things that like kind of sucks at times, but like it's just vastly better than any alternative that Gov can ever come up with. I think we're just going to be extremely comparative, walk down Gov bench and explain why each of their things is actually worse in their world. Let me first deal with Greg's extension, which more sounds like a rant about his thesis not getting published. Okay, let me explain what's going on here. Right? Like, if you're risking 3 to 5 years of your research, as OG says that it takes a long time to do research, and if you want to risk it on a new method that is being published in an extremely unreliable place on a centralized forum, you want it to be correct. So maybe you come up with, maybe like there is that one brilliant paper come up, but it's ignored unless it is like absolutely corroborated, even if it takes more time to corroborate it, right? Because people only do research projects which are low risk because of the reasons that OG outlines, that it takes so much time. This means that unless you are sure that your research, the things, the foundations of which you are building your research on are absolutely sure, you're unwilling to take any risks on their side of the house, which means we get far more risky research on our side of the house anyway in the first place, because we're able to actually be sure that we're not going to get like other kinds of risk in our research in the first place. But secondly, like a lot of this, as Greg points out at the bottom of MG, is just symmetric, right? Like academics have a huge incentive to talk about their research, because the more people talk about it, the more their like public clout is built, the more people respect them in the world of academia. This means that all of OG's impacts are extremely symmetric, because the forum that they want exists in status quo. Different fields do it differently. Math has the archive, and like other physics also has like the physics archive, and the like CS has its own field, and like I know that like econ does it through Twitter somehow. It's very complicated, but I know like these things exist in the first place, right? People criticize papers, people publish blog posts, people follow other academics on Twitter and follow these docs. I think the second rebuttal we have to OG is that look, it is good that you don't pay these researchers for doing things that they are doing for free. Like, researchers love dunking on other researchers because it makes it like an interesting intellectual exercise for them. It is interesting to the field for them because it means that the field gets less bad research published in the first place. Thirdly, it is just like, it just makes them look good in the court of public opinion that exists on both sides of the house because you're seen as someone who publishes responsible research on both sides of the house, right? So if you can do it for free, like, I think you should do it for free because the funding that they say on their side of the house, if you buy all the arguments that academia is structurally underfunded and doesn't have massive amounts of money to do new types of research, put that money to new types of research instead. If academics are like very willing and have it in their career incentives to still go through massive amounts of research in the first place and dunk on it on Twitter or wherever they want to do it. I think they do this on both sides of the house. Alright, now let's talk about like what our new extensions are in this debate, right? I think there's massive benefits to the peer review process that just are independent of like what kind of research is published in the first place. That is to say, the painful process of peer review that like takes 8 to 9 months on OG is actually really good for every academic involved, right? I think there's multiple things that occur here that are really good. Firstly, I think it forces a large number of academics who by the way, like I think something that was missed in this debate is like most peer review is done like in volunteer services, that most professors just have like responsibilities to do some amount of peer review as a part of their duties. This means that like in the sense that like peer review doesn't cost very much on both sides of the world. By the way, given that it doesn't cost much on both sides of the world, this means that a lot of what given that professors still want to seem like people who do like peer review in the world and give service to these big journals, means that like they read massive amounts of papers, especially because peer review papers like make sure that you read papers that are like away from your paradigm, because they have an incentive to expose you to new types of research, because you are the best at criticizing research that is in another field. This means that your peer review process forces you to interact with research that you wouldn't interact with otherwise, makes you go on new forums that you wouldn't go in on GovSci. Why is this particularly important? Because I agree with Greg here, because research is like a network effect, right? Like the ideas that you have in research really require you to think deeply and be exposed to random ideas and find new sources of inspiration. On our side of the house, every single researcher is able to get far newer sources of inspiration because they read far more research, and more importantly, they read research that challenges their preconceived biases in the first place, which means the paradigm shift that might happen in their world doesn't get accepted in the hearts and minds of researchers who can take that paradigm shift and do new things with it without CEO's extension in particular. The second thing we have is that there is a massive cost of research. But before that, I'll take OG.
Yeah, but the problem is that your criticisms, even if they sometimes happen for free, happen on their Substacks because they can't get published in a journal and they don't have the clout to be in Bloomberg.
Like, okay, sure, we can say that archive should introduce a comment section. Like, if you want to abolish peer review, we can introduce the comment section on our side of the house. I think that takes less PR. I'm very happy to defend that if you want. But secondly, I think Greg is like wrong in some sense that I don't think a lot of research is just meant to be like 1% of the research coming out and becoming effective, right? I think a lot of research is just like ordinary day-to-day things that need to be incremental changes, that need to be published and need to be correct. Arthur touches on this at the bottom of like LO when he says something about like engineering research needing to be important. But note what happens in their side of the house. There is a massive cost that is passed on to people who want to use this research, right? Because before they like get to use this research, they have to verify that it is correct. This means that the peer review process does occur on their side of the house. Except it occurs by the people who are paying to use this research, who want to take these ideas and do good things with it in the real world. But before they can do any of that, they have to make sure that they check this research. They have to make sure it's correct. Often they're not even experts in the field. They just have to think that like, hey, this machine learning algorithm is really cool. I want to make like a good software out of it. But they're unable to do so because they just don't have the ability to check this research on the first place. The third piece of extension, which means that people use less research, we think that's bad, we think academia is generally good and you should use research. Thirdly, I think this makes coordination of research harder. Look, we're going to bite the bullet from OG and say that, hey, look, it is good if research is coordinated by people, and it is good if people work on the same ideas. Because I think the largest problems that humanity faces today cannot be solved by researchers who, without peer review, have an incentive to always publish different papers to differentiate themselves as heavily as they can from other researchers, because that helps their individual brand as researchers. On our side of the house, the incentive that academia creates through the peer review process to conform to a certain kinds of research means people work on the same difficult problems that humanity faces, make sure that they coordinate this with other researchers, because that is the kind of research that will be published, which means that this is a specific selection bias, which means that we can get massive new advances. This means that people, like journals accept papers that like say, like think about solving climate change in the first place or do weather modeling or something like that, which means that more people are likely to work on these problems. Be careful about the methods in these problems, and this homogenization of research is actually a good thing and helps us solve the largest problems that humanity faces. I think CO takes this debate pretty clearly.
Here. Thank you to the member of opposition, and we call on the government whip.
The mechanism by which top half changes anything is, or research changes anything from top half is incredibly unclear. I just do not know why we care abstractly about the values of academia for papers that often get read by literally no one because they are making marginal changes. The things that we actually care about is these types of methods advances that change cancer research and allow you to do the most amazing things. First, just stating very clearly why I think these types of good papers will get to the top regardless. I think almost all important research comes from important people. Why is this the case? One, you need funding, you need a lab, you need a lot of staff. Even if you're in some other field that's not like medical field, you often just need a lot of grad students to help you crunch numbers, to go out and data collect. And it's just very expensive to do this types of research. This means the ability of like a untenured professor to actually make life-changing research is very small. Usually they're just kind of trying to find a data set, run some analysis that's good enough to make some contribution to publish in a paper. That's pretty much how I did my thesis because I had no money. It wasn't going to change anything. I think as a result, I think that means that you waste a bunch of people's time just trying to publish journals articles so they can get tenure, and they honestly is a lot better ways to make tenure articles if you're talking about untenured professors. But these types of good research that comes out is likely to be peer because you're going to get government funding for it because it's going to be published by nonprofits, and that rises to the top, even if it is off things like that you work at Harvard. Harvard has some really great labs, and I think that's fine. Let's go through CO's case and rebut them. First, they say people are just going to chat in their interim, so that beats our case on working papers. Sometimes I come out of a round and say, wow, I ran a boss extension. And everyone goes, okay, but they don't give a shit until they hear the call, because I might be an idiot. When peer review is the standard, you cannot do anything with the research published. Because if you expect everything to be peer reviewed, if you then start working on a paper based on the methods that I told you about, but my methods weren't peer reviewed, if they turn out to be bad, you won't do anything. Even if you are 99.9% sure these are good methods, you are too scared because the standard in the field is wait till it's peer reviewed. This means you just lengthen the time, so I don't think chatting in the interim really solves anything. They say their next part of the case is just like it's good to be exposed to papers, and peer review does that. Look, you are also doing research yourself. You're a grad student who takes classes. You often teach classes. You learn a lot of information, so I think this extension is so marginal. And then finally, they talk about the massive cost of research, and if you mess up, it can lead to really bad things. One, I think that no amount of analysis from a peer-reviewed paper is going to make someone who's building a bridge not run simulations themselves. But in the worst case, I think this means you probably expose the data and methods that you use more clearly, and that is strictly good because it allows, maybe it takes less time to get published, but it allows people to actually rigorously check your thing before they use those types of things, which means you actually get more checking, and I think this is a better mechanism than OG. Finally, they say you conform to research to coordinate. I'm not just sure to what extent you actually do more coordination, but you're just trying to wait until you get your published before anyone else does it, so you probably don't want to tell other people about it because you need to make sure you get the credit in the article before anyone else, and you don't want them to rush the peer review and do it. Okay, I think that takes out most of CO. What does OO say? I think they say a couple things. First, they talk about believability to the public. Look, as Greg PY's pretty clearly, we just do not read peer-reviewed articles. We just look at who, Harvard economists on Twitter, do these types of things. Also, second, I think peer review lets a lot of dumb-ass articles in. There was that whole scandal a few backs. We literally made up gender studies papers or psychology papers and just published them, and they got through peer review, and they honestly just massively discredited the field. So peer review is actually not that rigorous because these people are busy and don't have a lot of time. Second, on academia, I've just not not sure how much this changes things. I think it probably reduces the stress of people, which is probably good because better research if they're not stressed. And second, I think if the tenure committee now actually looks at the research you've done and makes these decisions, maybe looks at your teaching, it's a more nuanced decision than summing up the numbers of how many people got in. So that's probably not that big of a deal. Developing countries, I don't think there's an impact. It took 7 seconds. There was no way. I don't really know how much this changes things. Fourth, on shorter projects, one, government grants still often require you to do longer types of projects because you have a funding for that type of thing. You also have endowments from universities and do these types of things. And funding is often not from peer-reviewed journals because they are for-profit, so I don't think this changes anything. I think if you publish quicker, it is still fine. You just publish more incremental papers along your research process to do these types of things when you have the grant that lies after this. Finally, they say corporate capture of funding. Not clear why this changes on either side. If I have a corporation who can run a massive pro-sugar campaign, I'm not sure why it matters if there's a peer-reviewed article, because I just don't think they tell you why people are particularly convinced by peer review. Yes, I will.
Peer-reviewed articles affect how media institutions cover research, and they affect both the political will and donor will to fund research, because a donor doesn't know who a good academic is if they don't have a good track record of peer-reviewed articles.
Yes, I think we know who a good academic is because they got the government funding, because they got promoted at an elite university. I think the people on the tenure committee often can review you much more clearly than these like random peer-reviewed articles. I just don't think it's actually that good of a signal for how journalists do these types of things, so I don't think this matters. Weighing against OG really quickly. I think a lot of the problems they have are just solved by anonymous review, which opening opposition points out, so I'm not sure when this percentage applies. But second, I just don't know why we actually care about this. Like, in 95% of these papers, 99% of these papers, they just, like, things, it just doesn't affect the real world. I think what we tell you very clearly from opposing government is there is a section of papers that should be published as soon as possible. The types of good ones that everyone will know are good. The types of papers that come from people that add new valuable methods. These are the types of things that if you are going to make it to the top, and this allows just 1.5 more years of good, valuable cancer research. And I think that's the thing that actually changes lives. I just do not care about the state of academia. To some extent, I don't even really care about these professors' lives. I care about the academics, or the academic research that actually changes these types of things, because you're not going to waste your time trying to fit the perfect format, trying to fit the sections, wasting all your time with a grad student to try to fit exactly how this journal wants it to be published, and instead you are actually just putting it out there, you are publishing it earlier, and you're getting this. When you have a world without peer review, yes, maybe we rely on elitist metrics like that, but I think we probably still rely on those in the status quo because they're the ones who can schmooze with peer reviewers at these types of things and find out exactly how they want things to be done, exactly what this journal needs. You can get advice from your advisor. All of those types of things give massive advantage to people in elite institutions either way. But I think what we get is much better and quicker doing these things. You're not wasting grad students' time doing this. You're not honestly just wasting massive amount of academic researchers' time. Probably all these peer reviews are just wasting a bunch of time doing peer review. Like, they should probably just go be doing research, and they could be publishing that and doing a lot better. I think as a result, like, even in the worst case where you get more bad articles, I think one, the conspiracy theories do exist in either world. I think two, people don't really care much about peer review anyway. So I think the more important thing is getting the best articles out as quickly as possible. I think for all those reasons, so proud to propose.
Here. Take the government whip and call on the opposition whip to close out the round.
I think the debate is fantastic, but it is not because that debaters are right, it's because debaters say things that are obviously wrong, and then they give 3 structural reasons why they are true. I think this is something which is very valuable, because then you go home at the end of the day and then you say, hey, why is this something that's false? Why is it the case that I have these beliefs ingrained into me, and why are they something that's valuable? We think having the ability to be exposed to information outside of your comfort zone, in order to do things like engage with fields that you haven't talked about before, is the only way in which you're able to get meaningful research that actually is life-changing. What were the 3 things that Rohan told you that are winning this debate for us? The first is that peer review is very good even if you reject papers because you see things that you wouldn't before. Now, opening government's alternative to peer review is that you're going to have some sort of academic journal Reddit on steroids. I think the problem with this is that you're more likely just going to be engaging with research that is already within your own field. You're going to want to look at the papers that are most established as opposed to random grad or PhD students' papers. Why is this something that's awful? Because one, you're far more likely going to be insulated as a top academic, as opposed to in our world, we have an incentive as a volunteer to try to read as much as possible. Second, you're not going to be reading papers for things outside of your own career. You're just going to decide to engage with economics if you're an economics professor, because that is what you believe is in your field of best interest and you want to maintain your credibility. But on our side of the house, there's a higher chance that you see an economics paper with a dash of anthropology, with a dash of ethnography that allows you to change how you view things, to change how you view research in the future, even of something that you rejected. And I think this is what's really important, what closing government is missing, because the solutions to all the economic problems of the world are not going to be found in the cesspit of the field that is economics. Is the ability to have cross-pollination between many different ideas, the ability to engage with new solutions, particularly at a time where you're in a very oversaturated, incestuous academic journal market which produces the same ideas over and over again. The second thing that Rohan gave to you that was groundbreaking is that there's still going to be some fact-checking on their side of the house. Because notice that all the arguments they give to you about why these ideas are good are contingent on these ideas being implemented. But on their side of the house, they don't have the rubber stamp of a seal, they have an endless debate of updoots and downdoots. Why is this really bad? Because it means that when corporations and other public facilities are considering whether they want to implement these ideas, they have to try to fact-check it themselves. This is comparably worse because these people are, one, more likely going to be far more averse to new ideas that are good, but two, just likely not going to have any kind of expertise that allows them to make these evaluations well, meaning that even if they prove they get more good ideas on their side of the house, they have not proved they are able to facilitate these ideas and get any benefits out of them. The third thing that we told you, and this is really important, is they get the polarization of research on their side. Why? Because when there was just a large market or social media place of all these different academic articles, you as an individual researcher have an incentive to publish something that is controversial, something that diverges from the norm, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe peer reviewers are going to get very mad at me, maybe I should collaborate with existing research, maybe I should look at things that other people decide to research on and cooperate with them. Why is this something that's really important? Because first, I think it proves all of the government benefits of solving issues like climate change, of solving issues like world hunger through things like collaboration. But secondarily, I think it also links into the opening opposition case about trust. That is to say that when you have more different minds, more groupthink on how to solve the world's most pressing issues, people decide to buy into academia more, they're more likely going to fund it, they're more likely going to say that it's something that is valuable. That's why our case against opening oppositions. The first thing I want to note is that I just think that they are somewhat uncharitable. Our case isn't contingent on the idea that you open the floodgates to just a huge amount of wrong information. I think government bench has thoroughly refuted this idea by telling you that there are many alternative mechanisms for fact-checking. Maybe we can make a far more marginal change, but I think it's something that we have proved to a significant degree. We get at least maybe a 1% chance of better life-changing ideas. Second, I just think that there's a massive tension in their case, where on one hand they say, well, you're not going to publish research that you view as something that is risky, but you're only going to decide to publish research for people who you believe are established in the field. I think these ideas are somewhat contradictory because presumably those who are most established are publishing research that is very cautious, that is not taking huge risks, which is what they advocate for. I think we evade that on our side of the house. Let's talk about both the government teams in this debate. Before I go on, I'll take a point from opening government.
On your side of the house, old tenuous professors reject innovative research because they're self-protective, risk-averse, and have no accountability, and then researchers don't risk doing that research. On our side of the house, that innovative research sparks substantial discussion, it's important, and sees the light of day.
Yes. Okay, so on your side of the house, this is still going to happen, because well-trusted professors are just going to get on Bloomberg, and they're going to say, yeah, this paper is bullshit, do not read it, or people just don't engage with it in the first place, because there's millions of academic ideas. But on our side, they have an incentive to read it thoroughly, and at least think about how they're engaged with research in the future. Yes, this is a marginal change. Every single other benefit in this debate is marginal. We're the only ones that prove that it's true. Let's talk about closing government. They say that everyone is going to see good research, and this is the good research that matters. Their case makes sense if 100% of the papers we are talking about are the ones that cure cancer, but I posit to you that the number is a little bit lower. Look, I think they just say that this is some sort of inevitability, that you're always going to say good research. We think this is the consequence of living in a world with peer review in which you are able to determine what is reliable in the first place. They say, politicians have an incentive to implement things that are correct. One, I forgot, this is why politicians are very good at implementing economic and criminal justice policy and never do things wrong. Second, you don't know if policies are good before you implement them. They say that you have an incentive to forward your mates papers that are quite good. You also have an incentive to forward papers to your friends that you think are like super controversial or super wacky because you think they're good. But also you just have plausible deniability. So if you forward a paper that you think is really life-changing and it turns out that this is something that was totally wrong, you could just say, oh, well, I didn't know what data set they were using. I didn't know what kind of testing they were using. And I don't think that is something that just destroys the reputation. Let's talk about opening government. I think the first problem with opening government is that all of the critiques that they talk about how to just make sure that you have public discussion of academic papers is something that is solved through a comment section. I think that our case is just something that is additive. They're able to have peer review, you're still able to have public discussion, but at least on our side you get better exposure to ideas. Second, I think they just clearly lose the incentive battle because there's this very strong assertion that says, well, all of these professors are people who are elitists, they don't care about anything. And I think that opening opposition kind of does beat them on this material where they say there's some incentive for academic journals to perform well. I don't think they prove that they're bad 100% of the time, but I also think that they get a little bit better at our side of the house because, professors aren't perfect. I think that this is something we all kind of know, particularly me. It goes to a school called the University of Chicago, but they can have a heart that melts away a little bit. They can have the ability to go back home, to question their ideas, to at least engage with thoughts that they haven't had before. I have a little bit of faith in them. Very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Here, thank you, Robert.